Mr. President, in recent days and weeks, the House of Representatives has passed legislation called the Waxman-Markey bill that deals with the issue of climate change, and particularly deals with the issue of trying to decarbonize the energy use in this country in order to protect the planet. I support the goals of a low-carbon future and trying to decarbonize the use of certain energy that we have that puts greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and which causes a scientific conclusion that I think is a consensus of scientists that we are endangering our planet with respect to the potential of future warming of the planet. So I support the goal of trying to deal with this issue of climate change. The question is, how do we address it? How do we move forward? The House of Representatives has established one approach. I want to mention a couple of approaches that I think we ought to try that represents a different approach than that which will come to us in the Waxman-Markey legislation. And as I do, let me just say this is a very big issue with consequences for virtually all Americans, for families, for businesses, and for our climate, certainly. The question for us is, how do we move forward in a way that uses energy and creates energy in a different way, in a better way to protect the environment? Now, we wake up in the morning, all of us do, and begin our day taking energy for granted. One of the first things we do is we flick a switch and a light comes on. Or perhaps we use a hairdryer, or we put something in the oven. In so many different ways, virtually everything that we're doing is a use of energy. We get in our cars and drive to work, or we get on a subway. We're using energy, and we're using a lot of energy. The current Secretary of Energy, Dr. Chu, is a Nobel scientist, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. He's had a way of describing it at one point that I heard. He talked about going back a couple of thousand years. When a couple of thousand years ago, someone wanted to go out and find something to eat, they got on one horse. Because, of course, we had horsepower then. And someone would get on one horse and go find something to eat, presumably through hunting or gathering. These days, of course, times have changed. We still use horses, but in a different way. We measure it as horsepower in an engine in a vehicle. And someone wants to go get a loaf of bread, they'll crank up about 270 horses and go to the grocery store and get a loaf of bread. Never think much about the advantage of having energy at our command at almost any moment, and we certainly don't think and haven't thought very much about what the use of that energy does to the climate. So here we find ourselves in the year 2009 with what the consensus of most scientists is a very serious problem for the future of this planet. And that is greenhouse gases, which would warm the planet and cause very substantial consequences. And therefore, we need to try to find the way towards a low-carbon future, lower emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere. So how do we do that? Well, as I indicated, the House of Representatives has written a bill, Waxman-Markey. It's a 1,400-page bill, 1,400-plus pages of legislation. Very, very complicated, I might add. Let me describe another approach. We have written in the Energy Committee here in the United States Senate a new energy bill. It was completed some weeks ago, passed with bipartisan support in that committee. Let me describe just a bit of what we have done in that energy bill. We reduce our dependence on foreign oil. We increase domestic production of domestic electricity and electrify our vehicle fleet to move toward a different kind of future with respect to our vehicle fleet. We create a transmission superhighway so that you can produce renewable energy where you can best produce it, wind and solar, and then put it on the transmission grid that moves it to the load centers where it is needed. And we train an energy workforce of tomorrow. These are just a few of the things we have done. We establish a renewable energy standard, a renewable electricity standard of 15%. And it needs to be higher. But the fact is, it is the first time that we will have established a standard saying we want to maximize the production of renewable energy. That's green energy in most cases. When you're taking energy from the wind, gathering energy from the sun, and producing electricity and putting it on a transmission grid and moving it to where it's needed, you are producing green energy. That is a significant, giant step toward climate change. Or rather, I should say, toward addressing the things we need to do to deal with the climate change threat. Producing green energy, maximizing the production of green energy. And we've done so many things in that legislation. Even as we do that, we have twin issues we need to address. Protecting our planet, yes, but at least with respect to the vulnerability of our country, it's also a case of 70% of our oil coming from off our shores, so we want to make us less dependent on foreign oil. So the legislation also expands the production of energy here in this country. It opens up some areas that have not been open in the eastern Gulf of Mexico to oil and gas. As you know, natural gas is a clean-burning fuel, has some great properties, and we need to increase production in those areas. So we're doing a lot of things in this area to address or move toward the solution to the threat to our planet. Electrifying our vehicles, moving towards an electric drive transportation system. Clearly, we're going to move in that direction, and our legislation moves in that direction. So I believe that what we ought to do, addressing a number of these issues, is we ought to address the piece of legislation that we passed in the Energy Committee, bring it to the floor of the Senate. I mean, I've, of course, talked about this at some length in recent weeks, but I really think that the energy bill we have produced is a significant step towards addressing the climate change challenge. So it seems to me it would make sense to do the energy piece first and bank that progress in addressing climate change, get that to the President, get it signed, and legitimately being able to boast about what we have done in a significant way to maximize the production of green energy, maximize the use of energy from the wind and the sun and biomass and so on, and move it to where it's needed. That is not an insignificant achievement at all. I think we ought to do that. Second, on the question of cap and trade or Waxman-Markey or a carbon-restrained piece of legislation of some type, let me talk about that just for a moment. Clearly, the Senate is going to deal with that. My preference would be that we not take up the Waxman-Markey bill as such. I know a lot of work has gone into that legislation, but my preference would be that we start in a different direction. And it's not that I have disagreement at all with the issue of capping carbon. I believe we have to have a low-carbon future. I believe we will cap emissions of carbon. The question is especially establishing targets and timelines that allow us to do that, and at the same time that we provide a low-carbon future, we don't cause the substantial disruptions that we could cause if we create targets and timelines for CO2 emissions that are simply unachievable. We have a lot of people all across this country that are doing inventive work, really interesting, world-class, cutting-edge research that will unlock the opportunity to find out how do we sequester, how do we capture, how do we provide beneficial use of CO2 so that we protect our environment. I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that we will achieve that goal. The opportunity through research and technology to unlock the mystery of how we separate or perhaps just capture carbon, sequester to provide beneficial use, and protect our environment from the substantial emissions of CO2, I'm convinced we'll do that. I don't think there's much question about that.